The Sunday service had just ended when Marcus walked into Evergreen Fellowship Church for the first time in 18 years. The sanctuary still smelled like polished wood and old hymnals, exactly as he remembered. But what brought him back wasn't nostalgia. It was the funeral program in his hand, the one with his father's face smiling from the cover, the one that called him beloved pastor, devoted servant, pillar of faith. Marcus crumpled the paper in his fist. They didn't know. None of them knew what really happened behind the doors of the parsonage, and today he would make sure the truth finally came to light. Marcus had spent 3 decades carrying a weight no child should ever bear. His father, Pastor Jonathan Whitmore, wasn't just respected in their small Virginia town. He was revered. People lined up after services just to shake his hand. Mothers brought their troubled teenagers for his counsel, and the church board hung on his every word like scripture itself. But Marcus knew something they didn't. The man who preached about love on Sundays became someone entirely different when the church doors closed. Someone whose shadow still haunted every corner of Marcus's mind, even now, even at 42 years old. The memory surfaced without warning, sharp as broken glass. Marcus was 7 years old, sitting at the dinner table with his younger sister, Rebecca. Their mother had made meatloaf, and the kitchen glowed warm under the yellow overhead light. Everything seemed normal until their father noticed Rebecca had left 3 green beans on her plate. The sermon that followed lasted an hour. Not about vegetables, but about disobedience, about children who dishonored their parents, about the fires of hell waiting for the ungrateful. Rebecca cried silently, tears dropping into her mashed potatoes, while Marcus gripped his fork so hard his knuckles turned white. Their mother sat frozen, eyes fixed on her own plate, saying nothing. She never said anything. That was the thing about Jonathan Whitmore. He never raised his hand in anger. He didn't need to. His weapon was something far more insidious, something that left no bruises anyone could see. Words became daggers, silence became torture, and scripture became a tool of control sharper than any belt. When Marcus was 9, he accidentally broke a window playing baseball in the backyard. His father didn't yell. Instead, he sat Marcus down in his study, surrounded by shelves of theology books and framed degrees, and explained calmly how disappointed God must be, how the angels wept when children destroyed what others had built, how perhaps Marcus wasn't truly saved after all despite his baptism, because a saved child would never be so careless. The boy spent the next 6 months terrified that he was going to hell, praying every night until his knees ached, begging God for forgiveness for sins he couldn't even name. Rebecca got it worse. She was sensitive, artistic, the kind of child who felt everything too deeply. Their father sensed that vulnerability, like a predator sensing wounded prey. When she was 11, she painted a picture in art class, an abstract swirl of colors that her teacher praised. She brought it home beaming, eager to show her parents. Jonathan studied it for a long moment, then asked her what it meant. Rebecca explained it was just about feelings, about how colors made her feel. He nodded slowly, then told her that feelings without purpose were vanity, that art glorifying the self instead of God was idolatry, and that she should be ashamed for wasting the talents God gave her on something so meaningless. He made her throw the painting away herself, watching as she crumpled it into the kitchen trash can, her small hands shaking. The worst part wasn't the cruelty itself. It was how invisible it remained to everyone else. At church, Jonathan was a different man entirely. He laughed with the elderly widows, played basketball with the youth group, delivered sermons that moved people to tears. He organized food drives and visited the sick and counseled struggling marriages with such apparent wisdom that couples credited him with saving their relationships. Marcus watched all of it from the front pew, week after week, wearing his pressed shirt and forced smile, wondering if he was losing his mind. How could the same man who destroyed Rebecca's confidence on Tuesday speak so beautifully about God's unconditional love on Sunday? How could he counsel other fathers to cherish their children when his own kids flinched at his footsteps? When Marcus turned 13, he started keeping a journal, not a diary of daily events, but a record of incidents, dates, times, exact words his father used. He wrote down the evening his father spent 2 hours explaining to Rebecca why her body was becoming a stumbling block to men, how her developing figure made her responsible for the thoughts of others, how modesty wasn't just about clothes, but about making herself invisible. She was 12. Marcus documented the Sunday his father preached about honoring parents, then came home and berated their mother for 40 minutes because the pot roast was dry, never raising his voice above a conversational tone, never using a single curse word, but reducing her to tears through sheer relentless criticism disguised as concern. The journal filled up, then another, and another. Marcus hid them in the crawl space above his closet, wrapped in plastic bags, convinced that someday they would matter. Someday someone would need proof that this was real, that he wasn't imagining it, that the perfect pastor everyone adored was slowly suffocating his family behind a curtain of scripture and smiles. By the time Marcus was 16, he had learned to survive by becoming invisible. He excelled in school because failure meant lectures. He volunteered at church because absence meant questions. He dated the girl his father approved of because rebellion meant spiritual warfare. He became a ghost in his own life, going through motions, checking boxes, waiting for the day he could escape. Rebecca didn't have that luxury. She tried to fight back in small ways. She wore clothes their father deemed inappropriate. She questioned his interpretations of Bible verses. She defended their mother when he criticized her. Each act of defiance was met with calm, measured destruction. No yelling, no violence. Just carefully constructed arguments about her spiritual state, her rebellion against God's order, her path toward destruction. By 15, Rebecca stopped eating regularly. By 16, she rarely spoke at all. Their mother, Patricia, had long ago surrendered any fight she might have once had. Marcus sometimes wondered if she had ever fought at all, or if Jonathan had chosen her precisely because she wouldn't. She moved through the house like a shadow, cooking and cleaning and smiling when required, but absent in every way that mattered. When Marcus tried to talk to her about Rebecca's obvious depression, Patricia just patted his hand and said that families go through seasons, that prayer would fix everything, that they needed to trust God's plan. She had scriptures memorized for every deflection, verses about submission and suffering and the testing of faith. She was as much a victim as her children. Marcus understood that now. But at 16, he just felt abandoned. The breaking point came during Marcus's senior year of high school. He had been accepted to 3 universities, all far from home. He chose the one in California, as far as he could get without leaving the country. When he told his father at dinner, Jonathan set down his fork and smiled. That smile still haunted Marcus's nightmares. His father explained very calmly that Marcus wasn't going to California. He was going to attend the small Christian college 30 minutes away, where he could live at home and save money and remain under proper spiritual guidance. When Marcus protested, his father didn't argue. He simply asked if Marcus was rejecting not just his father's wisdom, but God's will for his life. He wondered aloud if Marcus had ever truly surrendered to Christ, or if he had been living a lie all these years. He suggested that perhaps Marcus's desire to flee was evidence of unconfessed sin, of a heart running from conviction. That night, Marcus made his decision. He would leave, no matter what. He worked double shifts at his part-time job, saved every dollar, applied for scholarships his father knew nothing about. He told his college counselor everything, carefully, quietly, knowing he couldn't prove abuse that left no marks. The counselor believed him. She helped him file the application secretly, helped him arrange financial aid, helped him plan an escape. The day after graduation, while his parents were at a church leadership retreat, Marcus packed a single duffel bag and left. He didn't say goodbye to Rebecca in person. He couldn't. She would have cried, might have tried to stop him, and he was barely holding himself together as it was. Instead, he left her a letter hidden in the crawl space where he kept his journals. In it, he promised to come back for her. He promised she wasn't alone. He promised that someday, somehow, this would all make sense. It took Rebecca 4 more years to escape. Marcus called her every week from California, their conversations brief and coded because their father monitored her phone. She told him about college, about the business degree their father insisted she pursue instead of art school. She told him about the young men from church their father introduced her to, about the pressure to marry someone suitable, about the slowly tightening noose of expectations. Then, one October morning, she called from a bus station in Richmond. She had taken everything she could carry and just left. Marcus wired her money, helped her find an apartment in Portland, watched from across the country as his little sister slowly, painfully, began to rebuild a life. Their mother never left. When Marcus called her after Rebecca's escape, Patricia cried and said she was praying for both her children, that they had broken their father's heart, that she hoped they would find their way back to God. She didn't understand, or wouldn't understand, that they hadn't left God. They had left Jonathan Whitmore. Those were two entirely different things. The years passed. Marcus built a life in San Diego. He became a trauma counselor, specializing in religious abuse, helping others recognize the patterns he knew too well. He married a woman named Diana, who came from a healthy family, who showed him what love looked like without conditions, without scripture wielded like weapons. They had 2 daughters, and Marcus swore he would never be his father. Every night when he tucked them in, he told them he loved them. Every night, he meant it. Every night, he proved to himself that the cycle could be broken. Rebecca found her way to art therapy, using creativity to heal herself and others. She never married, never had kids. The idea of family, she once told Marcus, still felt like a trap. They talked every Sunday, a ritual they both needed. Sometimes they discussed their childhood. More often they didn't. The past was a presence between them, always there, rarely named. Their father's church grew. Evergreen Fellowship expanded, added a new wing, started satellite campuses. Jonathan Whitmore became a minor celebrity in evangelical circles, writing books about family values and godly parenting. Marcus saw his face on Christian television once, talking about the importance of discipline and structure in raising children. He had to turn it off before he put his fist through the screen. The irony was suffocating. The man who had psychologically tormented his own children was now teaching others how to raise theirs. Then, 3 weeks ago, Marcus got the call. His father had died. Heart attack. Sudden at 68 years old. The funeral would be Saturday. The entire town was devastated. The church board asked if Marcus would speak, share memories of his father. He said he would think about it. Now standing in the sanctuary where he had spent 18 years of Sundays, Marcus looked at the flower arrangements surrounding his father's casket. Hundreds of people had already filed through, sharing stories of Jonathan's kindness, his wisdom, his faith. An entire wall was covered in cards and letters celebrating his life. Marcus read a few. A teenager wrote about how Pastor Jonathan had talked him out of suicide. A single mother described how the pastor had paid her rent when she was about to be evicted. A recovering addict credited Jonathan with leading him to Christ and sobriety. These weren't lies. These things had happened. That was the cruelty of it. Jonathan Whitmore had genuinely helped people. He had saved lives, strengthened faith, made a difference in his community, and he had also destroyed his own children with methodical precision. Both things were true. Both things could exist simultaneously. Rebecca arrived an hour before the service, wearing black and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. She and Marcus stood together near their father's casket, 2 middle-aged adults who still sometimes felt like terrified children. She reached for his hand and he held it tight. Neither of them cried. People probably thought that was strange, that they seemed so unmoved. Let them think it. The service was everything Marcus expected. Speaker after speaker praised Jonathan Whitmore. The senior deacon called him a giant of faith. The worship leader said he was the most godly man he had ever known. A visiting pastor from another state said the church had lost a prophet. Marcus sat in the front row, jaw clenched, listening to the sanitized version of his father's life. Next to him, Rebecca was absolutely still, barely breathing. When it came time for family to speak, Marcus stood. He hadn't prepared notes. He didn't need them. He walked to the pulpit, looked out at the sea of faces, people who loved his father, people who were genuinely grieving, and he made his choice. He could let them keep their illusion. He could preserve the legacy. He could protect the reputation of a man who had never protected him, or he could tell the truth. He started speaking. His voice was steady, calm, much calmer than he felt. He thanked everyone for coming, for their love and support. He acknowledged that his father had touched many lives, that the stories they shared were real and meaningful. Then he paused, took a breath, and said that he needed to share another story, one that had been kept secret for too long. He saw his mother's face go pale in the front row. He saw Rebecca sit up straighter, suddenly alert. He kept going. Marcus described what it was like growing up as Jonathan Whitmore's son. He didn't yell or accuse. He simply told the truth. He explained the double life, the man who preached grace and practiced control, who spoke of God's love while wielding Scripture as punishment. He talked about the terror of living under constant spiritual scrutiny, of never being good enough, of having every mistake turned into evidence of moral failure. He mentioned Rebecca's destroyed artwork, his own desperate journals, their mother's learned silence. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't need to. The facts were devastating enough. The sanctuary became absolutely silent. Marcus could hear people breathing, could feel the shock rippling through the pews. Some faces showed disbelief, others showed recognition. He realized watching them that he wasn't the only one. There were others who had seen glimpses of this, who had sensed something wrong but couldn't name it. His honesty was giving them permission to acknowledge what they had always suspected. When he mentioned his father's books on parenting, his voice finally broke. He asked the congregation how many of them owned those books, had followed that advice, had tried to raise their children according to Jonathan Whitmore's principles. Hands started to lower slowly as people began to understand. He told them that his father's methods had left deep scars, that he and Rebecca had both spent years in therapy, that their childhood had been a masterclass in spiritual abuse disguised as godliness. He said all this without anger, just profound sadness. Then he did something unexpected. He forgave his father. Not because Jonathan deserved it, not because the abuse was acceptable, but because Marcus refused to carry the poison anymore. He explained that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, didn't mean pretending it never happened, didn't mean trusting someone who had proven untrustworthy. It meant releasing the grip that hatred had on his own heart. He forgave his father for himself, for his own freedom, for the chance to live without that weight. But he also challenged the church. He asked them to consider how they had enabled this by putting his father on a pedestal, by refusing to question spiritual leaders, by valuing reputation over truth. He asked them to think about other families, other children, who might be suffering in silence because they had been taught that exposing a man of God was a sin. He asked them to be better, to look deeper, to remember that being a good preacher doesn't make someone a good person. When Marcus finished speaking and returned to his seat, the silence was deafening. No one knew how to respond. Some people were crying, others looked angry. His mother had left, he noticed. Her seat was empty. Rebecca reached over and squeezed his arm. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. He had done it. He had said the unspeakable. The rest of the funeral passed in a blur. People avoided Marcus and Rebecca, unsure what to say. A few approached them afterwards, older members who quietly admitted they had seen concerning signs over the years, but hadn't known how to address them. One woman, a Sunday school teacher, apologized through tears for not protecting them. Marcus hugged her and said it wasn't her fault. The system had failed them all. In the parking lot as people were leaving, a young man approached Marcus. He was maybe 25, wearing an ill-fitting suit, clearly nervous. He introduced himself as David, said he had grown up in the church, that Pastor Jonathan had been his mentor. Then he said that hearing Marcus's testimony had broken something open in him, because his own father, also a respected church leader in another town, had done similar things. He had never told anyone. He thought he was crazy. He thought he was the problem. Marcus listened, then gave David his business card. He told him he wasn't crazy, wasn't alone, and that healing was possible. They talked for 20 minutes in the parking lot while the crowd dispersed, two men from different generations connected by the same wound. By the time Marcus and Rebecca left, the sun was setting. They drove to a diner outside of town, ordered coffee they didn't drink, and sat in a booth by the window. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Rebecca said that she was proud of him, that what he did took more courage than she had. Marcus shook his head. She had survived. That took its own kind of courage. They sat together, two survivors of a war no one else had seen, finally able to rest. Over the following weeks, the fallout continued. The church leadership released a statement acknowledging that they had received Marcus's testimony and were reviewing their policies on accountability and pastoral conduct. Some members left the church entirely, unable to reconcile what they had learned. Others doubled down, insisting Marcus was lying or exaggerating or had misunderstood his father's intentions. The congregation split, painfully, messily, the way truth often splits things. Marcus's mother called once. She said terrible things, accused him of destroying his father's legacy, of being ungrateful, of serving Satan. He listened until she ran out of words, then quietly said he loved her and hung up. He didn't call back. Some bridges, he understood now, couldn't be rebuilt. Some damage was permanent, and that was okay. He had Rebecca. He had Diana and his daughters. He had a chosen family that loved him without conditions. Rebecca started painting again, real painting, not art therapy for others, but art for herself. She sent Marcus a photo of her first piece, a canvas covered in shattered fragments of stained glass, beautiful and broken, and whole at the same time. He hung it in his office where he could see it every day. The journals Marcus had kept as a teenager, the ones he thought might matter someday, he finally burned them in his backyard fire pit. He didn't need them anymore. The truth was out. The secret had been spoken. He watched the pages curl and blacken, watched years of documented pain turn to ash, and felt lighter than he had in decades. Several months after the funeral, Marcus received a letter from a woman named Jennifer who attended Evergreen Fellowship. She wrote that she had been in an abusive marriage for 8 years, that her husband was a deacon in the church, that everyone thought he was godly and kind. She said that hearing Marcus speak had given her the courage to leave, to tell the truth, to stop protecting someone who had hurt her. She thanked him for his bravery. Marcus cried reading that letter, but they were good tears. His pain had meaning. His truth had helped someone else find theirs. On what would have been his father's 69th birthday, Marcus took his daughters to the beach. They built sandcastles and chased waves and laughed so loudly that other families smiled at them. When his youngest asked if he missed his daddy, Marcus thought about it carefully before answering. He told her that his father had been very complicated, that he had good parts and bad parts, that sometimes people could do wonderful things and terrible things at the same time. He said that he was sad about the bad parts, grateful for the lessons they taught him, and determined to be different. His daughter nodded seriously, then asked if they could get ice cream. They could. They did. Rebecca called that evening. She had been thinking about their childhood, about everything they had endured, and she had a question. Did Marcus think their father knew he was hurting them, or did he genuinely believe he was serving God? Marcus considered this. He said he thought Jonathan Whitmore had convinced himself that his cruelty was righteousness, that he had built a theology that justified his need for control, that he probably died believing he had been a good father. That was its own kind of tragedy. Years passed. Marcus continued his work as a counselor, specializing in helping people recover from religious trauma. He wrote a book about spiritual abuse, dedicated it to Rebecca, and donated all proceeds to organizations that supported survivors. The book became required reading in several seminary programs. Pastors reached out to him, thanking him for opening their eyes to patterns they had never recognized. He spoke at conferences, trained church leaders, helped develop policies that protected the vulnerable instead of the powerful. Rebecca thrived in her art, her pieces exploring themes of captivity and freedom, darkness and light. She had a show in New York that received national attention, with critics praising her raw honesty and technical skill. Marcus flew out for the opening, stood in a gallery surrounded by his sister's visions of their shared past, transformed into beauty, and felt profound pride. She had taken what was meant to destroy her and created something that healed others. Their mother never reconciled with them. She remained in the house where they grew up, attending services at Evergreen Fellowship, maintaining that her husband had been a man of God, unfairly maligned by ungrateful children. Marcus made peace with that. Some people needed their illusions to survive. He couldn't save everyone, couldn't force anyone to see truth they weren't ready to face. He had learned to let go. On the 10th anniversary of his father's death, Marcus returned to Evergreen Fellowship one last time. The church looked different. New leadership had come in, younger pastors who implemented accountability structures and transparency policies. They had renamed the Family Life Center, removing Jonathan's name from the building. They had also created a memorial garden for survivors of spiritual abuse, a quiet space with benches and flowers where people could come to reflect and heal. A small plaque acknowledged past failures and committed to doing better. Marcus sat on one of the benches, watching sunlight filter through the trees. A teenage girl was there too, sitting alone, looking lost. He recognized that look. He had worn it himself once. He asked if she was okay. She hesitated, then shook her head. She said her youth pastor made her uncomfortable, that he said things that felt wrong, but everyone loved him, so she thought she was the problem. Marcus listened. Then he told her she wasn't the problem, that her instincts were valid, that she had the right to speak up and be heard. He gave her resources, told her she could talk to the new senior pastor who was trained in handling these situations, assured her that she wasn't alone. The girl looked at him with such relief that his heart broke and mended at the same time. Walking back to his car, Marcus thought about his father's legacy. Not the one Jonathan Whitmore had intended, all those books and sermons and appearances, but the real legacy. The children who learned to speak up, the churches that reformed their practices, the survivors who found their voices, the young people who were protected because someone finally told the truth. That was the legacy that mattered. That was what came from pain, transformed into purpose. Marcus called Rebecca from the parking lot. He told her about the memorial garden, about the teenage girl, about how the church had changed. She listened quietly, then said she was glad, truly glad, but she still didn't think she could ever go back there. He understood. Healing looked different for everyone. For him, closure meant witnessing change. For her, it meant never returning. Both were valid. That night, Marcus had dinner with Diana and their daughters, now teenagers themselves. They talked about school and friends and plans for the weekend. Normal things. Beautiful, ordinary, normal things. As he listened to his daughters laugh, comfortable and unafraid in his presence, Marcus felt something he hadn't fully experienced before. Victory. Not over his father, not revenge or vindication, but victory over the cycle. He had broken it. His children would never know the fear he had known. They would never question whether their father's love was real. They would never have to hide or perform or shrink themselves to earn approval. That was what freedom looked like. Before bed, his youngest daughter asked him to tell her a story. Instead of reading from a book, Marcus told her about a man who grew up in a difficult home, who survived things that tried to break him, who learned that the strongest thing a person can do isn't pretend to be perfect, but admit when they're broken and choose to heal anyway. He told her that telling the truth is scary but necessary, that sometimes the bravest thing is speaking up when everyone else is silent, that real strength is being vulnerable enough to change. His daughter listened with wide eyes, then hugged him tight and said she hoped she could be that brave someday. Marcus told her she already was. The church had called his father a man of God. His children had called him something else. In the end, Marcus realized that both could be true. Jonathan Whitmore had been capable of genuine faith and genuine cruelty, of helping strangers and hurting his family, of believing his own righteousness while causing immeasurable harm. He was not a simple villain or a misunderstood saint. He was a broken man who broke others, wrapped in the language of devotion. Understanding that complexity didn't excuse the damage. It just made Marcus more determined to be different, to be whole, to raise children who knew that love never hurts, that God is not a weapon, that family should be the safest place in the world. Years later, when Marcus was 60 and Rebecca was 58, they returned together to their childhood home. Their mother had passed away, and they needed to sort through decades of belongings. Walking through those rooms felt surreal, like entering a museum of their own trauma. Rebecca found her old bedroom, still painted the same color, and stood in the doorway for a long time. Marcus found his father's study, the shelves of theology books gathering dust. They worked in silence mostly, boxing up lives, deciding what to keep and what to release. In the attic, Rebecca discovered something that made her gasp, a box of her childhood artwork, pieces she thought their father had made her destroy. He had kept them. Every single painting and drawing, stored carefully, preserved. She showed Marcus with tears streaming down her face. What did it mean? Why keep them if he thought they were worthless? They would never know. Maybe Jonathan had felt guilt he could never admit. Maybe he had loved them in the only broken way he knew how. Maybe some part of him recognized what he was doing and couldn't stop. The mystery would remain unsolved. The contradiction would stay unresolved. They decided to donate the artwork to a program that provided free art supplies to underprivileged children. Rebecca's childhood creations would help other kids discover their own voices. That felt right, turning old pain into new possibility. They packed up the house slowly, scattered their parents' ashes in the church cemetery without ceremony, and drove away together. Neither of them looked back. On the drive home, Rebecca asked Marcus if he had any regrets about speaking at the funeral, about exposing their father's secrets, about choosing truth over comfort. He thought about it for several miles before answering. He said he regretted that it was necessary, regretted that children ever have to become whistleblowers in their own families, regretted that speaking up had cost them their mother and fractured a congregation, but he didn't regret the act itself. Silence would have been easier. Silence would have preserved relationships. Silence would also have been a betrayal of every other child suffering in similar circumstances. Sometimes love requires disruption. Sometimes healing demands the breaking of things that look holy but hide rot underneath. Marcus lived to see his grandchildren born, something he once thought impossible during his darkest years. He watched his daughters become mothers themselves, watched them parent with intentionality and grace, watched them build families free from fear. He saw Rebecca finally enter a relationship, a gentle woman who loved her without condition, who thought her art was sacred, who created the safety she had never known. He witnessed the multiplication of healing, the way breaking one cycle created space for generations of freedom. In his final years, Marcus sometimes wondered if his father had ever truly understood what he had done. He imagined Jonathan Whitmore standing before God, all pretense stripped away, finally seeing himself clearly. He hoped in those moments that his father had found the grace he never showed his children, not because Jonathan deserved it, but because mercy was bigger than Marcus's anger, because forgiveness was for the forgiver, because some mysteries belong to God alone. The last entry in Marcus's journal, written 2 days before he died at 81, said simply this: I survived. I spoke. I healed. I loved. I broke the curse. That is enough. That is everything. His funeral was small, attended by family and friends, and dozens of former clients whose lives he had touched. Rebecca spoke, calling him the bravest man she had ever known. His daughters shared stories of his gentleness, his patience, his unwavering presence. His grandchildren released balloons into a clear blue sky. There were no secrets hidden in that service, no double life, no performance, just honest grief and genuine love, and the celebration of a man who had transformed his trauma into something that helped others find freedom. The church had called his father a man of God. His children had called him something else. But Marcus's children and their children would call their father and grandfather exactly what he was: safe, loving, truthful, present, brave. And in that difference, in that transformation from one generation to the next, lived the truest sermon Marcus ever preached. Not with words from a pulpit, but with the life he chose to live, with the cycle he refused to continue, with the truth he was courageous enough to speak. That was his legacy. That was his victory. That was grace made visible in the slow, painful, beautiful work of healing.